So, needless to say, I didn't exactly react well to the sudden upswing of death. After that thing with the kid's ear and the dude with the bolo tie, I started smoking a lot of pot, taking Xanax by the truckload, eating a Roxy whenever I felt like it, drinking, and eventually downing NyQuil every night, just to avoid thinking about what was in front of me. The sheer quantity of what I was using was so immense that the idea of leaving was simultaneously enticing and horrifying, as there was no way I could afford even a single day without this job. Living this way can turn anyone into a creep. You don't feel like you're a part of society anymore, and the only thing that makes you feel alright is the drugs. I had learned to hate leaving my home with an intense passion. Although going to work, I usually took the long route, going to Palm Beach Island to watch the amazing cracks of dawn, cover the beautiful tropical island with its relatively old architecture that looks as close to European as anything a Floridan junkie is likely to see. The sour stench of body odor from the patients increased in strength and viscosity until it became a miasma, warmed by the Florida sun and humidity, multiplying it by about 2. After about a month, George sent a friend of his named Aaron to work the front desk, so that I could scan medical records and organize the files full-time. My new desk was unfortunately facing the wall, which placed my back to the waiting room whenever I sat down. On either side of the main room was a hall, with bathrooms and a large storage closet, and opposite that, another hall with 4 examination rooms, where the doctors wrote the prescriptions, and a small manager's office where Debbie hid to do drugs. Our own bathroom was between the medication room and the front office. Aaron was a relatively cool guy for someone who took a fuck ton of steroids, and, of course, always wore brightly colored, extremely tight shirts, with lots of busy tribal designs. I'm a pretty fat guy, so I have to admit, I always felt insecure next to him, but I did get hit on a lot. This phenomenon had nothing to do with women being attracted to me, at all. I had an absolute fuck ton of drugs, and everyone knew it. I managed to bathe regularly, but I pretty much always looked like shit and was wasted 24/7. But gorgeous young women would still manage to smile and twirl their hair at me. Amidst the devastated junkies and constant feeling of hopelessness were stunning young women, often dressed in the short, skimpy clothing Florida tends to encourage. They rarely looked comfortable there, and were usually in some varying stage of addiction, but they showed up every day. "Hey honey, me and my friends have to go to a school thing. You think you can help me out?" A stunning young redhead with long, cascading hair, wearing a short orange skirt and bright turquoise tank top, beamed at me from over the counter, hoping to bypass Aaron. He smirked and frequently encouraged this. He would go home with plenty of them. "Yeah, sure." I stumbled over to the appointment wall, where we stashed patients' medical files on a first-come, first-served basis. I was incredibly aware of how awkward and socially stunted I am. I skipped her ahead. She wasn't from the state. They never were, but they frequently tried to act like they were going to school or working down here to cover for that. "Hey honey, take my number out of my file." She leaned over the counter and gave me a look that no girl had ever given me, before winking and walking back to the doctor, ahead of the line. I didn't see her again until she left, but she bounced up to me when I was in the doctor's hallway after getting her medication. "Thanks, sweetie," she said with a thick Appalachian twang. She kissed me on the cheek and pushed a note written on our office stationery into my hand, before twirling around and walking out with the group of junkies that she came in with. I didn't think anything of it, because I was still unattractive, and the offers were either never genuine or were just in exchange for drugs. But still, she was painfully beautiful, a redhead with bright blue eyes and a face that faintly reminded me of some celebrity, at least in my head. The group she was with, in contrast, looked like a bunch of frightened hobos, most wearing the traditional camouflage and Walmart garb of the Appalachian people. I opened the piece of paper as I walked back to the main office and noticed that it simply said, "Please call me, Amber," with her phone number written below it. "Please call me" was written in such a way that the pen had almost punched through the office stationery. The phone number, oddly enough, was a local one. I hated myself for it, but I absolutely had to call her. I told myself that maybe she's in trouble, but they were always in trouble. I just needed more medication to get out of it. Also, they would usually offer to trade for sex, or at least insinuate it. When I got out of work, I called her the moment I got home. "Hello?" a frightened girl's voice asked. "Hi, this is Ted from the doctor's office. What's up?" I asked casually, expecting her to be more than happy to explain her horrible situation and how easily I could help her. Using a fake name was pretty standard, and Ted had already become second nature to me. "Honey, please, where are you?" Her southern twang was thicker than it was in the office, but it was her. She sounded more frightened than usual, and I began to become aware of the fact that she may be in a more genuinely frightening situation. The kind of people who crammed into those cars were usually broken human beings, easily taken advantage of by the ringleaders who drove them to Florida from Appalachia. "What's wrong?" I sat up suddenly, my old couch creaking below me. "I need to, see you." It was absolutely clear she did not mean this in a flirtatious way at all, but was trying to phrase it that way. "Where are you, honey?" she asked again, quickly. Praying to God that I wasn't going to regret it, and feeling a little disappointed that my deeply creepy fantasy seemed to be going nowhere, I gave her my address. Eventually, I heard an engine revving towards my home on the small street I live on, and then revving away from my house. She knocked a moment after that. She was in a different outfit and makeup, a tight and small light blue dress and eyeshadow to match. But her dress had been ripped a little at the bottom. She had a deep purple handbag. Through my door's peephole, she was staring out of the road she had just come from, as if looking for something. I opened the door and moved aside so she could come in. Thanks, she muttered after sweeping herself inside and quickly sitting down on a recliner I had from across my couch, where they both sat opposite a TV with a coffee table between them. She was almost shaking and looked like she had been through hell, despite her perfect makeup and nearly perfect dress. I'm sorry, she stammered, looking at the ground and not at me. I sat back in the couch. It's all right. You look like you're in some kind of trouble. Do you need help? I used the most reassuring tone a creep like me actually has. I doubted she would be able to call the police even if she wanted to. They would probably just arrest her for whatever part she had in her predicament. Yeah, she sighed, looked at me for just a second, and then went back to looking at the ground. I need help. Something happened. One of my friends is dead. She came with us down here, but she ain't got a way home because our ride got pissed at her. So she talked to this guy that looked good. He looked clean and she thought maybe he would give her a ride, or knew someone who could, 'cause he looked clean and respectable and all. It poured out of her, in broken, stammering Appalachian drawl. She looked around the room desperately while she spoke. The moment she mentioned the guy looking clean, I thought of that dude with the bolo tie. Good holy shit. I did not need that motherfucker again. I began to wonder, just briefly, how exactly Dave knew he was coming to begin with. She gone and went with him, She breathed in with a deep shudder. Her long, thick red hair moved over her face when she looked at the ground, and she made no effort to move it. She sobbed once, and the tears began to flow like a river. She thought he was safe, 'cause he seemed clean. She left American Injury with him the day before yesterday and took her part of her meds. She took her meds and went with him. His name's Lyle, and they left together, but she came back last night when we were in the motel, pounding at our door, screaming at us to let her in. We thought she wanted the meds Brody took to pay for her debt and the ride here, but before he even opened the door, she was gone. Her bag was dropped. It spilled everywhere, but she was just gone. Nowhere in the parking lot, nowhere at all. I call her cell phone and I hear her screaming, but it just cut out, and she won't pick up at all now. She was shaking, and her makeup was pouring down her face. So her and her friends were going doctor shopping, taking advantage of the fact that Florida did not allow anyone to record how many doctors were prescribing to a single patient. This allowed pillbillies to visit every clinic in the area on the same trip, especially American Injury Clinic, George's massive flagship and a thorn in the side of the DEA. And then someone called me from her phone and I just hear laughing, and then some kind of screech. And now we don't know where she is or who she's with. And everyone else, they just want to leave and pretend they didn't see nothing. That was actually probably the smart thing to do. The police were often just as dangerous as criminals, and I was slightly less effective at combat than a public sub. Do you think you should go to the police? I asked anyways, more to gauge the severity of her beliefs than anything. She stared at the ground, saddened. I mean, maybe. I gotta do something, 'cause they don't want to stay. They want me to stay with you at night and get more meds and leave. It suddenly sank in that all the girls flirting with me didn't have a choice, or at least didn't perceive it that way. This would give me a chill up my spine every time a pretty girl smiled at me in that clinic from then on. More girls for Aaron. I have plenty of meds, that's not a problem. One way or another, I could spare those at least. I reached to the coffee table where a small plastic bag from work contained 4 large pill bottles. I began to pour a relatively generous amount of roxycodone, Xanax, Percocet, and Soma into a plastic sandwich bag. For just a second, I wondered how many plastic sandwich bags were used for drugs, and whether manufacturers actually considered this during design. Probably. Her eyes lit up just briefly when she saw the amount of meds she was about to reap. I just wanted her to calm down, and they were basically free for me. I'll call my people right quick, she said slowly, still crying, but unable to avoid focusing on what was the bottom line for what may have been her friends or family, or maybe just some violent criminal she had to hang with. The line between them was usually pretty thin anyways. She dialed and mumbled into the phone quickly and inaudibly. Thanks. I don't know where Stacy gone. I didn't see what kind of car that Lyle was driving. He looked so pleased with himself, too. Her accent forced himself to sound like his self. I poured some crushed Roxy for her, and she got to work, taking in 2 entire rails. That took the edge off of her, and she was still weeping. As this shit tends to do, it makes you feel more resigned than at peace. She ain't even said where he from or going. I thought to myself that it might not be impossible to look up people named Lyle at American Injury, but that might not be his real name. But she said it was cool, and she would just call later, so she stormed out after a fight with Brody and told him to go fuck himself. That's why he didn't take her serious when she come back like that. She said this defensively, and I got the impression she regretted not taking her friends seriously too. From outside my door, I suddenly heard in a deep, white trash voice. Samantha, it's me. Come outside. I was suddenly very aware that I didn't hear a car pull up. I wondered if they had just dropped off more people, to keep her safe or to rob me. The fact that Amber was actually Samantha didn't bother me, but the fact that he used her real name sent a shock of ice up my spine. That was a bit of a faux pas around people that you didn't know in the pill mills, if it could be avoided, that is. Fake IDs were constant, and we didn't have to check particularly hard to dispense medication. Brody? She seemed stunned. She looked to me as if for advice. She hadn't called her friend more than 10 minutes earlier, or at least it seemed that way. Yes. Come outside, Samantha. His accent sounded as redneck as anyone, but there was something about how he didn't say, yeah, or really any slang at all, even in those short sentences. Just for a moment, Samantha. The voice didn't use a particularly reassuring tone, but it wasn't threatening either. She looked at me and got up. She walked to the door, and I felt my innards seize with ice. If it was anyone other than who she thought, or he had bad intentions, we were defenseless. I suddenly realized I didn't have a gun, but she opened the door and walked out. I heard her greet someone with a, "Hey," as she moved away from my house. At this point, I really wished I lived in the city, but I lived in a relatively isolated part of West Palm Beach, in an area that was more Everglades and less beach. It's a huge county, and I didn't mind the drive. I waited a few moments. The moments turned into minutes. The minutes dragged along, and I got worried. First for her, and then for me. After about 20 minutes, a phone call came in on my cell phone. It was her. I was massively relieved. This meant she had just taken her generous bag of pills and gone home, without having to do anything other than cry, which for her was probably a good deal, if she was expected to get pills from me by her group. It stopped ringing almost instantly, and I suddenly felt the drugs floating in my system as the adrenaline receded. I chuckled and got up to flip the lock on my door. The second I flipped the deadbolt, thinking that was the end of the night for me, I heard a voice on the other side of the door. Immediately on the other side of the door. "Wilkes, open the door." It was Samantha, and she sounded calm and clear. I turned around, but the sudden and gigantic pit of lead in my stomach compelled me not to bother looking through the peephole I normally made such use of. I wasn't sure what would be worse, seeing her there or seeing something else, but the fact that I never mentioned my name, it's not actually Wilkes, but you get the idea, stuck out in my memory like a sore thumb. It was generally a bad idea for us to mention our names, because it made us easier to identify. "Wilkes, could you open the door? Or come outside? I just want to talk for a second." There was a strange blankness in her questions. The voice from the other side of the door seemed to not know where to aim itself, and each word sounded like it was addressed to a different area of my living room. A thin layer of ice-cold sweat covered my torso and the back of my neck, and every second seemed like an hour. I didn't dare answer. "Wilkes, open the door, or come outside. I just want to talk for a second." It sounded exactly the same as when she had said those words a moment ago, but stitched together differently. For a moment, I wondered if a crude recording of some kind was repeating her voice, but I couldn't imagine someone getting a recording of her saying my name to begin with. Seconds or minutes later, her cell phone called mine again, and again, and again, and then it sent me a picture. I'm pretty grateful that my phone allowed me to delete that without viewing it. I stood next to the door staring at my cell phone, terrified that whoever or whatever was speaking in her voice might hear a step. I kept staring at my phone every time the ring started again, as if expecting my phone to say, "Just kidding, bro, she's probably fine." After a few minutes, I heard something rustle away from my door. I never heard another car pull up or anyone else. I called Dave the next morning. Jesus Christ. No, you did the right thing, dude. You really did. He almost sounded impressed. He seemed to wave off the hints that I was dropping that something other than a person may have been at fault for this. Bro, if you get any other phone calls or any of that shit, just ignore it. You know these junkies and their drama. She got you for some pills. Just let it slide. You'll see her again in exactly 1 month. Just don't bring it up and be cool about it. Losing some pills is no big deal. He knew damn well it wasn't the pills I was worried about, and I suddenly realized that although there was a chance of the phone call being tapped, he seemed happier to talk about drugs than weird shit. The thing is, she never did come back. I pulled the fake ID she used and she never showed for any of her appointment times at my clinic or any of the other clinics George owns. Because I didn't know her real name, I had no idea if there was anyone I could report this to that would make a difference. Or at least, that's what I tell myself. Things got worse quickly after that. I guess that was creepy enough to convince Dave that I was ready for some new responsibilities and a little more money, because that's what Debbie told me the next morning. I don't recall any other time in my life when a promotion left me filled with dread. This is how I began to get a much more open understanding of what was going on in the pill mills and Florida in general. Most of the days we left before 3 because we opened so early, at different times so that no one ever had to work more than 9 hours. One time, that didn't go as planned. Wilkes, we have a problem. Debbie didn't even bother looking up when I came in. She was chest deep in junkies trying to check in, but dropped the papers in her hand and motioned for me to go to the medicine room with her. Serious business. We're getting an inspection tomorrow. She stated this with such terror that, for a second, I thought she was hoping for an answer from me. We were technically legal, but only because the authorities had no legal ability to second-guess a doctor for prescribing anything they wanted, even if it had nothing to do with their fields to begin with. Pharmaceutical companies fiercely defended this sacred right as something that kept our medical professionals functioning at a necessary speed and with necessary flexibility for doctors. We have to go through the inventory. We might need to make some deliveries. By we, I do mean you. Sorry about that. She took a deep breath after she said that. I got a bad feeling about it right away. The different pill mills, all controlled by her boyfriend George, had to move fast to make sure each pill was accounted for, even if the counting was hilariously flimsy. The process was largely written by a pharmaceutical company with no interest in the DEA's goals to begin with. Yale Pharmaceuticals, through an account representative named Rhonda, coordinated with us on exactly how to pass this. They also made sure the representative they were required to send only came after store hours, so they wouldn't have any reason to report the army of junkies in the parking lot. There were tons of tricky little things like this at every step of the process to bury as many painkillers as you needed, just as long as you did it in bulk. We need at least 15,700 mallees, a lot of fentanyl, Xanax, you know, shipped to the American Injury Clinic. We have to make the books right, too. We're 2.5 ahead. Being 250,000 ahead in cash was a serious problem for this kind of business. Malincrote was a particular brand of oxycodone that was well known for their easy solubility and comfortable injection, meaning you could cook them and inject them easily. It was entirely possible for pharmaceutical companies to make additives that would make injections a lot less likely, but you see how it is. The American Injury Clinic was a massive building, a former school that dealt exclusively in painkillers and was the heart of George's empire. It pumped a vast river of narcotics into Ohio, East Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and everywhere else that had a lot of Confederate flags and not many jobs. I'm gonna need you to grab at least 2 trips. She said that as both an order and a question, wondering if I would go through with it and clearly watching my reaction. I needed about 160 milligrams of oxycodone and 60 milligrams of Xanax just to feel normal at this point, every day. To put this in market terms, it would be what non-junkies refer to as insanely fucking expensive. No problem. I stared her straight in the eyes so that we both knew I wouldn't be putting up the bill for my own habit anytime soon, at the expense of God knows how many others. She nodded and left, and I went back to the wall, grateful that this meant a couple more hours of me getting to face my wall. This was towards the middle of November, so the days were getting shorter. I had never worked past 3:30 or so in the afternoon and usually started before 7, almost always before sunrise. The bags will be ready. I have the doctor's powers of attorneys. Getting a physician to give a criminal power of attorney over their affairs was a critical part of the business plan that allowed them to store massive amounts of medication on hand. I decided to never ask how they got that. If anyone knew I was making the drive, I could be guaranteed to be robbed and killed. Also, as far as they knew, I might just try and drive off with a few million in merchandise and cash. The cash, legally speaking, did not exist, which made it a particular point of anxiety. The pills, legally speaking, had been resting in their destination the entire time, and if the authorities knew that we had to play an insane balancing game, we'd be toast. Knowing that my mother could get killed, I could get sent to prison and run out of drugs right away, as well as the fact I'd get extra pay if I did the job, was a solid way to keep me honest, though. Alright, just let me know when I go to the clinic. You're not going to their clinic. You're doing a dead drop on the island. Drop it at the golf course, in front of the schoolhouse, and go. In addition to the possibility of being robbed, now the possibility that the dead drop could simply be taken by a group of teenagers existed. The island in question didn't need any introduction to anyone in South Florida. Since the Kennedys reigned, Palm Beach Island was host to a crowd of wealthy, aging, and disconnected white people. The golf course had a small schoolhouse on it, left over from the days when Henry Flagler built the first railroad into the area. He also had a small village built for his black workers, right on the island, and when he didn't need them to build a railroad anymore, he invited them to a party, and while they were gone, he had men burn their homes down and kill anyone who had a problem with it. Then he built a tiny little schoolhouse right on that spot, while the poor black people were forcibly moved to an area called Riviera Beach in central West Palm Beach, where they were never heard from again. Suffice it to say, that schoolhouse is now in what is generally considered the most expensive part of town, a wealthy enclave with nicer, older architecture. Alright, I pretended I didn't have a huge problem with this. Good luck. Her voice wavered at that. She didn't seem happy with this either, but she wouldn't turn around from the counter to tell me about it to my face, and I wasn't going to force her to. I went about my day and waited for the bags of cash and drugs to be prepared by George's henchmen. Different guys this time, same amount of muscle and brightly colored affliction shirts. They didn't say a word and were gone in minutes, leaving 3 large duffel bags and 2 small duffel bags. I quietly drove around the back of the building where Debbie and I loaded the bags as quickly as possible. It was a small alley between 2 buildings, so it was relatively assured no one could see us. Wilkes, if you see anything at all, you need to call Dave. The red-headed Hulk had appeared more than once as a representative of George, sometimes giving Debbie orders, and was usually very easy to like, once you forgot that he probably had hurt people for money before. Are they worried about me getting robbed? Because dead drops are generally a bad way to go with that. She smirked, so I guess that a robbery genuinely wasn't on her mind, because otherwise she would have gotten serious. Just let him know what you see. Now she was being serious. I was suddenly deeply worried. I had already seen plenty, and this could have been a really convenient way to get rid of a no longer needed liability. But I was at the end of a long stretch without a pill, and I knew in the back of my head that I didn't really have a choice. Unless I wanted to be shitting myself in a hospital bed in no time. I nodded and got into the car. She banged on the trunk when it was loaded, and I drove off. The sun was going down, turning Florida's sky into an explosion of pinks, oranges, purples, and blues that defied the imagination. I drove through West Palm Beach, grateful that the rivers of SUVs and economy sedans were moving in the opposite direction towards the residential areas of the county. I headed down a massive bridge in between relatively large towers and a small, absurdly expensive private Christian college across the intercoastal waterway from Palm Beach Island, named Palm Beach Atlantic University. It's a creepy little place. The sky over the ocean was jet black by 5:30, making it look like the city was on fire with some kind of incredible burst of neon turquoise and angry fuchsia. These colors reflected on every single pane of glass and ivory surface in the small, beautiful island town. I drove down the jet black coast until I reached the curve in the single road on the island that let me know the golf course was coming up. I slowed down and briefly checked behind me for any other cars, but the curving road and thick vegetation made that futile. By the time I got to the golf course, I had made my peace with the fact that if I was followed, I was too unaware of it to do anything about it. The parking lot was empty, but there was a slight indigo glow coming from the beach that I assumed was from high school students getting drunk or high. Sure enough, I heard laughter, some music and talking from that direction after I put the first bag down where I was told. After the second, I noticed that the talking seemed to be coming closer to me and I looked up. They kinda looked like kids. They were small, at least they looked that way from the distance. Two of them were wearing what looked like brown shabby pieces of loose clothing from the distance, while the third, I couldn't really make out, but seemed to be dressed in white. There were 3 of them that I could see on the hill that buffered the beach from the rest of the island. I kept my head away from them in case the cops would end up asking them what I looked like, and moved the bags into a crevice between the pavement of the parking lot and school as fast as possible. By the end of the bags, I realized that I no longer heard any music, talking, or laughing. If the sound of footsteps creeping up on you is bad, the sudden lack of sound from someone you know to be there while you're committing a felony is 1,000 times worse. I looked around expecting to see someone, but those kids were gone. I dropped the last bag and slung my fat ass into the driver's seat. I spun the wheels of my car, just a little accidentally, trying to get out of there quick, and prayed to God that a cop didn't hear it. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I noticed in my rearview mirror one of the kids staring at me. It was the one in white, and he was standing on top of the schoolhouse I had just pulled away from. The only light was a parking lot light in between us, so it was difficult to see, but I know it was staring at me. The kid was standing on one leg, his entire torso bent at the waist, and his face turned up at me, just like the person in the bathroom. I saw a bright, pale oval face, but couldn't make out any of the features, turned up at me at an unnatural angle, like something out of Cirque du Soleil. I didn't give a shit about the cops anymore and hit the gas a little. Never hit the gas when you're not looking through the front windshield. Basic rule of driving. Almost right away, I heard a terrible thud, and something got pulled underneath my 1986 Monte Carlo. A blast of what looked like brown cloth or feathers went everywhere. A sickening snap underneath my car let me know that I may have just crossed a serious line in life. The adrenaline was so much that I had no idea what to do. I drove. I swerved to my left, almost off the parking lot to get away from whatever was underneath me. I furiously threw the wheel in the other direction to aim myself back at the exit again, and hit the gas again when I heard something smack the roof of my car. Something off to the left of me either swung at my car or something. Brown blur struck the window right behind my head and blew out the glass. I heard something that sounded like either an old church organ horribly misfiring or several people wailing at the same time from the beach. I was out of the parking lot by the time I heard it though, and I had no interest in whatever was making it. Despite having potentially just killed a kid, I felt very strongly as if I was the one who was going to be a victim tonight. I sped like crazy until I was off the island. The whole sky was jet black then, with just the lights from the towers looming over the West Palm Beach. Then, I drove at exactly the speed limit, as if the shattered glass wasn't even there. I didn't even turn on the radio or air conditioning during the ride. There were oily-looking feathers in my front grille when I got home. The roof had deep grooves scratched into the metal right behind where my head was. There was a smell coming from the car that reminded me of the smell of dead fish on an overused and undercleaned pier. When I got home, I called Dave right away and told him everything in one very long sentence. He didn't seem surprised at all. "How many of them were there?" he calmly asked. 3? I don't know. 2 other than the one I hit." He chuckled at that. "I don't know what happened to the bag." I was horrified at the prospect that my employers might take such a loss personally, but if the bags weren't picked up, he gave no indication. "Listen, I'm not going to stop over there, and neither is anyone else here." I breathed a sigh of relief. I took this to mean that he wasn't going to hold me accountable, at least not right now, for the loss. "So if you hear me outside of your house, or Debbie, or anyone else you're not expecting, do not leave your house. Even if you hear me telling you that it's all right and that we need your help, you do not set foot outside of your house unless we call you on your cell. Don't worry about the bags or the cops. You did good. Don't worry about coming in for a while. Just relax. How much water do you have at your place?" I checked quickly. I had 10 gallons in 2 large 5-gallon containers. I got 10 gallons. "All right. Sit tight for a couple of days at least. Don't go out, and I'll be by on Tuesday to drop off more water and let you know what's going on. For now, you did good though. Oh, if you happen to look outside a lot, try not to do it from nighttime to the early morning, especially not in the morning." He cleared his throat loudly, while I wished I could make myself believe he was talking about the cops. I wondered how much of what was happening he understood, and from where. "So remember, never go out in the morning. The morning worms are for the birds." He hung up. That last statement ended up scaring the shit out of me until I had enough Xanax in me to kill a donkey. But he hung up right after saying that, leaving me wondering whether I was in danger if I did leave the house, and from what. About a minute after he hung up, I heard a scraping sound coming from my roof, brief but clear. 6 days later, when I was given the all clear, I found horrible smelling greasy white feathers in the gutter right over my door. After that, Dave seemed to gain some trust in me, possibly because I was shit terrified, taking drugs to hide it, and not asking questions. In retrospect, I was, for the first time in my life, what an employer would consider a model employee. I got a huge raise, a call girl sent to my place as a gift, and a ton of drugs. It soon became apparent I was clearly the organization's go-to guy for extremely weird shit. Christmas was just around the corner, and apparently Santa decided it was time for me to pay up for years of missed coal opportunities. At that moment, though, the only thing on my mind was getting Dave to talk in person, so I could learn whatever he knew about this shit, because he seemed to know when and where these things would be at least.